And here we are back again. It's the Wilk Report. I'm Michael Wilk, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Back with me after a really long while is Larry Bernard, coming to you from Florida. How are you, Larry?
Pretty good, pretty good. Yeah, it's been an issue of timing connections and some technical difficulties, but I'm glad we were able to get the time together and most of the technical stuff nailed out.
Yeah, and we're back with some really hyperbolic bullshit over Netflix's Cuties, because apparently trying to get people to think about this thing in a nuanced manner and not rush to judgment before you've seen it is basically akin to defending pedophilia, according to a lot of outrage merchants and clickbait pushers. Which, ay.
Well, calling it pedophilia is really unfair. Calling it even sexual exploitation, that gets kind of complicated, but we'll get more into it. But this was clearly exploitive of the children that starred in the movie. But Hollywood's done that. This is nowhere near as exploitive as what Jodie Foster had to deal with in Taxi Driver or Brooke Shields back in the day.
Yeah. If you saw Brooke Shields in Pretty Baby, I mean, from what I understand, there was an uncensored cut somewhere that got pretty graphic. I've never seen it. I've never been tempted to see it. But yeah, as I understand it, that thing is a lot more graphic than this movie will ever try to be.
Now, there is some stuff about the cinematographer for this film and having some more racy, child-related stuff going on. So that's something I'll talk a little bit more about when we get into talking about the nuts and bolts of the movie.
Yeah, and you know what? I've actually had on my news feed every now and then I'll get something about tweens. You know, they're like twerking and gyrating after school or something, and it's like they're basically kids just like goofing around and play acting at being sexy, but kind of failing. But people are in an outrage over the behavior, and it's like, but you've got Miley Cyrus twerking on Alan Thicke, who's like 20 years her senior, and I mean, what do you think people are gonna? I mean, what do you think the result's gonna be? Kids imitate what they see adults doing.
So that's what the producers of the movie want you to take as perspective, but that's not even accurate actually for the movie. So did you get a chance to see the whole movie, or did you only get through a portion of it?
Only a portion of it. I actually wasn't going to see it, but then I figured I'd have to do a follow-up on this because the movie's been released for a few days now and the outrage merchants are still going at it, so I figured I'd have to. I'm only into the first 20 minutes or so.
It's an extremely boring movie with about 3 to 7% of the movie that's extremely uncomfortable.
Right. Well, you have to keep in mind European cinema, the pacing is a lot slower because they have longer attention spans than we do over here.
It's not boring because of pacing. It's boring because of what the content of the movie is about.
Oh, I see.
So you hear it's a movie about child exploitation, especially child sexual exploitation. For that to be the case, the movie would have to contextually provide you with judgment, where society views what the children are doing is negative. The movie doesn't. Nowhere at all. While there is some booing in the one scene where there's an audience, there's also cheering, but most of the audience seems largely indifferent to what's going on. When there are adult authority figures seeing the cuties doing what they're doing, they're largely annoyed by them, and in the case of the school authorities, they punish them in ways that are appropriate for school authorities to punish children who aren't behaving properly. But there's no real moral judgment or framework built in here. Now, the movie very much wants to have a feminist lens of sexual liberation, but it doesn't want to go all the way and commit to that, because that would be committing to the idea of 11-year-olds being self-driven actors committing to their sexual liberation. But it doesn't also want to say, you know, this is kind of gross. It's just indifferent to it.
Okay,
but this
is pretty interesting, because the few parts that I have seen about it so far, it's like I said, it's the first about 15-20 minutes or so. It's mostly focusing on the protagonist, Amy, and her mother as she deals with her father taking on a second wife, and the mother's kind of like suffering through this because I remember because I just recently started watching this, so it's still fresh in my memory. But the mother, her daughter catches her standing outside the bedroom where the wife number 2 is going to be sharing the bed with their husband, and has a rather emotional reaction to it, and then later on, Amy is trying to dress like her neighbor, whom she's seen in the laundry room, and ironing her hair on the ironing board and burning it, but she hides under the bed because she doesn't want her mother to see how she's dressed, and then the aunt, her mother's aunt, comes in with her, and the aunt is pressuring the mother to call up all her friends and brag about how husband's got wife number 2, and then when the aunt leaves, mother sits down on the bed and starts crying because obviously this is kind of humiliating for her.
I want to get into that, but I want to talk about the opening because there's something people who come from a secular and non-religious background are gonna miss about the opening. That's a consistent theme line throughout the whole movie. And if you don't realize that that's what's being done in the movie, and it's being done explicitly from point A all the way to the end of the movie, things aren't going to make as much sense. The opening of the movie is an Islamic prayer session that's led by the women. I don't know if the older woman is actually an aunt. I'm assuming she is, but she's the female elder in that community that lives in that housing project.
Yeah, according to the subtitles, that's what she's called during conversation. So I'm assuming she's an aunt. I don't like to watch the dubbed versions because it's like they always seem to get it wrong.
But that could also be an honorific. She could be viewed as the auntie because she's the elder. The opening is all about a Islamic prayer session focusing on temptation, and particularly the danger of temptation for women in the world. And temptation hits Amy immediately. And her first initial temptation is she sees other children not being forced to be in the prayer circle and be treated as adults. Then the second temptation comes when the aunt, the prayer leader, loses her prayer reeds. Amy picks them up, doesn't give them back, and doesn't say, hey, you dropped this. And it is after that, those initial 2 points of temptation, and one which is a commission of sin, albeit minor sin, that she's exposed to the sexuality of the female neighbor and becomes entranced by it. In particular, long hair has certain thematic references in Quranic literature towards temptation, and that is her start of her fall from grace. And the entire movie is consistently about Amy's fall from grace. The ending, which is very jarring unless you see it as a spiritual and morality tale, doesn't make any sense. But if you see it as a spiritual and morality tale, it makes sense within that theme structure of the movie, but it doesn't really work well because there's so many other moving pieces because they also wanted to be a modern multicultural film.
I see. So basically kind of like a movie that might be like a debut feature for the director who's still trying to figure out what she wants the story to be.
Well, this is based off of a traditional Senegalese morality tale of the young child being tempted by the outsider world, the secular world, and being led astray from the traditional moral values. But what the movie does, which I think it could have been interesting if it was better developed, is it views Amy's going away as a byproduct of her being forced to be an adult too early. She's assisting her mother in raising the kids, and we see her as the primary caregiver for her 2 younger siblings, which are both brothers. And when she is first tempted by her friends, the titular Cuties, it's in the process of her taking her 2 brothers to do the grocery shopping.
I see.
And she becomes entranced and led away from that. But throughout the whole of the movie, Amy begins to lie and lie consistently. She begins to steal to get what she wants. She uses provocative sexuality twice to achieve her goals, and she escalates all the way to violence.
Oh, wow.
So the whole child sexuality message, which is in the movie, that's a very small portion of the movie. The bulk of the movie is about Amy's progress of going into a descent into immorality and deprivation, as well as in parallel her mother struggling with dealing with a sister wife coming in. and her mother coming to terms with it at the end of the movie is coupled with Amy returning from the darkness, so to speak, and her mother saying, listen, you get to be a kid again. And you can then also look at the fact that there's going to be a second wife involved. Like, are the two wives going to be taking over the moral duties of the household as the mother? Is that perhaps the fact that Amy had to do all this work? Why the second wife's coming in? Those are things that could have been more developed if they stayed at like what was the central heart of the movie. But the director was also fascinated by really young children and sexuality. And so she has a lot of moving parts related to that that kind of distract from that core heart of the morality tale.
Yeah, well, it does seem to me like, yeah, because reading about the movie before it was released, it seems like the director actually had seen a lot of this stuff in her own childhood growing up as an immigrant in France, and, you know, maybe kind of made that connection between the immorality that her protagonist goes through, and then, you know, kind of like drawing a parallel or correlation between that and the behavior she witnessed when she was growing up. Now, like I said, I've seen sometimes on my news feed the occasional article like where kids are like after school or whatever, they're like trying to be like basically like Miley Cyrus or whatever and kind of failing at it. But you know, it's like I can't imagine, you know, her seeing stuff like that and maybe thinking, you know, that's kind of connected to what she's trying to portray in the film. So,
but if that was the case, the film would show the girls being entranced into sexuality by others. It doesn't. Amy seeks out the hypersexualized stuff. She's the catalyst for the cuties becoming even more sexualized than they are, and she seeks that out. She seeks that out with a cell phone she steals from her cousin or the cousin of her father's new wife. It's not super clear the relationship there. But again, the world isn't sexualizing these children. They are choosing to become sexualized. They are seeking out that knowledge and seeking out that information. So it's not about sexualization of children. Because if it was, then the children would be exposed to things, they would be sexualized, but instead the children consistently seek it out. There's also a scene where they talk to a guy on like a chat roulette kind of program where they're hiding themselves on the camera and then they expose themselves to him. And he's offended because he was sexually flirting with children who lied to him about their age. They're kind of provocative towards him, and that causes a little tension in the girls, but we'll get to that in a moment. They also go into the boys' bathroom and take a picture of a boy peeing. It's not done in a sexually offensive way that you like see him peeing that way, but that's what happens. And again, they're not being sexualized; they're being sexually aggressive and just seeking it out.
Okay, so kind of like you know, kids on the cusp of puberty, and they're kind of realizing this aspect of themselves. Then, or I mean,
kinda.
Okay.
So the girls are consistently portrayed as immature, but also trying really hard to portray themselves as hyper adult.
All right. And so basically, how kids behave pretty much today normally.
I mean, it's fairly realistic. Fairly.
Yeah, obviously there's going to be liberties given that it is a movie. But I remember, you know, that there was a similar backlash over The Trouble with Being Born, which premiered, I think, late February, early March, and the critics were saying it was glamorizing pedophilia. But from what I understand from people who've actually seen the movie, there's like a suggestion like early on in the film, but it's actually more about how people use the android, which is made to look like a human child, and basically kind of force it to kind of conform to basically kind of trying to make it recreate a loved one who was lost previously. Like the first owner lost his wife and daughter in an accident, and he tries to make the android basically be a version of his daughter again. And then the second owner is like this old woman whose brother died as a child, and then when she comes into possession of the android, tries to make it look into like a little boy, but you know, because it's a piece of hardware and it's kind of ambiguous as to how sentient it really is, so it's got obvious limitations and can't fulfill that function. So it's really more of a critique on how people abuse technology to fulfill specific needs that they can't fill otherwise, and also draw a parallel between how they use children in that same manner, you know, because we expect them to conform to how we want them to be, as opposed to how they really are. So, I mean, but it seems like, you know, they, much like with Cuties here, they're taking that one small hinted aspect and blowing it up so that it sounds a lot more sinister than it really is.
So there's 3 sequences in Cuties that are really the problem. One sequence is they're going into a laser tag place, and the girls try to seduce a gross older male provocatively to get in. But again, he's really gross, and the way they're doing it doesn't really work, so that's not as problematic, but it's not really necessary for the flow of the story. It's just really kind of weird.
Yeah, so it might be one of those things that seems like kind of forced within the story. It's like you don't need it, but I don't know. Yeah, because there are directors who, like I said, I mean, if it's their first outing, they might still be trying to figure out, you know, what's the best way to actually get from point A to point B, and make your point. But maybe sometimes, you know, that's something that could have been left on the cutting room floor because it's not needed.
There's a second sequence where the cousin comes to get his phone because he realizes it's missing, and he realizes it had to have gone missing at Amy's residence, and she's sexually provocative with him. And again, she initiated the sexual provocative nature of the other previous scene to try to keep the phone. He blows her off. That's pushing the edge of being wrong, but the film shoots it in such ways that you're meant to feel really uncomfortable. I'll add in a 4th scene, too. There's a 4th scene that's of note. There's a sequence where the aunt and the mother are basically trying to do an exorcism on Amy, and while the process of the ritual goes on, she's doing a very aggressive sexual booty dance in the prayer circle area. And she's like getting water sprinkled on her. It's really weird.
Okay.
And it's not done in a sexually provocative way, but she's humping the floor.
Do you think like she's maybe just doing all this out of defiance, and maybe like the...
It's very vague and ambiguous the way the film does it. It's a very art house European ambiguous scene. You could take it that she's possessed by a devil in this scene, and the scene says you're right, or you could say she's being, you know, resistant. You could also say she's right, or you could say she's having a seizure, and you could be just as right in either of those three interpretations of the scene. It's kind of really weird. Then there's the final dance scene, which happens after Amy tried to kill one of her friends to get back into the group.
Wait, tries to kill one of her friends?
Yes, she tries to kill one of her friends.
Is she?
She pushes her into the river, and if the friend doesn't make it to a buoy, she would have gotten sucked out of the ocean and drowned and died.
Oh, man.
So to get to the climactic final dance number scene, Amy's willing to commit murder. So that's, again, why this is totally a morality tale, and anything about sexuality or coming of age really isn't what's going on in the story. And anybody who says that isn't doing a really good analysis of what's going on in the movie.
Yeah, because it sounds like this is a kid who's got some serious problems, and not just when it comes to twerking.
Right, but we're going to go back to that in a minute. But now, the dance scene, there are some things that are shot that are like on the razor's edge of being obscene. The way that things are shot very tightly on the groins of the girls, in the lower hip region. Those are things where if somebody who was an expert on child sexuality in a legal obscenity context were to tell me I'm wrong, I would be willing to reconsider my opinion. And this is where the fact that the cinematographer has taken some film footage that's been pushed the envelope a little too far in certain countries in the past for child sexuality, that's an appropriate kind of thing. And also, the sequence isn't a triumphal sequence because it turns on a dime, and then Amy realizes how far from grace she's fallen in the entire cycle of the movie. So then she starts crying and she runs away from the dance. So it's really strange to focus on the sexuality when you have the moral climax of the movie happen that doesn't really need sexuality to achieve it. I don't know why that's there, and I'm not entirely sure that's the director/writer's voice there, because that doesn't seem consistent with her voice elsewhere in the movie.
Right. Well, so, maybe it could be like, and this is just a guess here because I didn't write the film and I haven't had a chance to learn all that much about it, but it seems to me, and you know, there are, you know, certain films where it's like you reach a point where the character reaches a point of realization where it's like, oh shit, I've gone so far off the deep end and I need to come back. Maybe, you know, that was meant to, you know, kind of illustrate, you know, how far this is going, and then she realizes, like, oh god, what am I doing?
It's more of a supernatural realization than an actual. There is a physical phenomena. She had like little fragments of her mother's wedding dress that fell, but I don't know if those were always on her during the dance sequence. But it feels very supernatural in how it's shot when she has that moment of realization. But the other problem for me with the whole dance sequence is, as I said before, most of the audience was ambivalent. There were people who were clearly repulsed. There were people who were grossly fascinated. The judges for the contest were judging it as serious art. I don't know what the point of that audience shot sequence is. I don't know what the point of the dance sequence is for the arc of the movie. Because Amy returns to a state that's actually slightly regressed and more into childhood than where she started the movie. So I don't know what the point of her achieving a sexual catharsis was at that point in the movie. Also, you had her having her period earlier in the film, and her aunt talking about how she wanted her to have, you know, a beautiful white wedding as a young bride. So that's not even really a necessary sequence for her to achieve that sort of moral realization of how far she fell. I think a much more compelling realization would have been, I almost murdered my friend. I don't even think that whole dance sequence is really necessary for the narrative structure of the film. But I think they invested so much in building up to the dance stuff, and the director was really interested in the lives of young women who were doing that. I think they committed too much to something that really took away from the heart and core of the film.
All right, so yeah, I mean that does make a lot more sense. I mean, just because, you know, one of the things that has pissed me off over the last couple of weeks since this whole thing started, and even today on a Twitter thread, because someone was asking, you know, what all the fuss was over the movie, and I was giving, you know, basically, you know, what I felt was like, you know, people who've actually seen the movie say it's not really about that, but, you know, it's like there's a, you know, a lot of clickbait pushers and outrage merchants and stuff who are just like going apeshit over the wrong thing for the wrong reasons and calling it something it's not because they haven't actually seen it, and you've actually seen it and have helped me put it in more context and thinking, yeah, this is something that really people really shouldn't be in such an uproar about, that, you know, any attempt to inject nuance is labeled pedophilia, because honestly, it's like any attempt to actually discuss things that happen in the world, especially when it revolves around children and sex, because unfortunately, whether we like to admit it or not, you know, especially as they start entering puberty, kids do become more sexually active or aware, and we don't have these kinds of frank discussions, and that's where problems come in.
The 21st century is an age dominated by a broad feeling of powerlessness. So when something that appears to have power, like a film, we can kind of cut into the power dynamic of the film, because that's another problem with the film, in my opinion. But when something like a film and something like Netflix, especially within the broader context of the coronavirus pandemic crisis, where Netflix becomes the major social fabric glue, this sort of moral message being broadcast to a broad audience, with the imprimatur of Netflix agitates people from their sense of powerlessness and their desire to protect people who they feel are even more powerless than them, which is children. So it's not a good thing, but here is my personal opinion of what I think happened. I think nobody at Netflix understood what this movie was about, because most of the people on Netflix are Americans, so they don't have a grounding in French culture. They don't have a grounding in French immigrant culture.
Or in Senegalese culture either.
Or in Senegalese culture. So I think they saw these girls twerking. They associate that with Beyonce, with hip hop. They associate that with some of the more progressive political ideology, and they try to make an advertising pitch based around that. And they were betting either people are going to watch it because they're invested in that sort of political culture war values, or it's going to create a controversy that's just going to bring more attention to it, that'll bring more people to watch it. I feel like that's what Netflix did. I feel like Netflix has exploited all of this to their gain.
Yeah, because it seemed pretty obvious to me from the bad Photoshop job on the movie poster that they initially released. They were trying to drum up controversy for a movie that probably otherwise never would have gotten the views that it has already. Basically it's pure cynicism. There was no, to the extent that I think there was any thought put into it at all, it was probably just, we want to drum up enough views for this movie to justify paying for it. So we're just going to, make this provocative poster and, try to market it to whoever, because we're not sure what we're even marketing anyway.
Exactly. Another major problem of this movie is it's a movie where the primary acting is based on 11 and 12-year-olds. And they're acting like very accurate 11, 12-year-olds, which are very obnoxious and terrible. I mean...
Yeah, I've met my share of tweens and teens who have been horrible people.
Yeah, if anybody out there has children, I'm sure your children are wonderful, but to everybody else, your children are awful. We find them obnoxious and terrible to deal with, but we deal with them because we know in a year or two, they'll enter a teenage phase where they're on the road to becoming an adult that we can just accept and deal with. So we accept this bad phase and go into that. So that's why this movie, it took me 5 watches to deal with, because the children were just so obnoxious, so terrible to deal with.
There was a movie back in the 90s. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. There was a movie back in the 90s called Kids that featured nothing but obnoxious kids who, and in fact, there was actually a scene in there where some guy's yelling at them and they proceed to gang up on him and beat him to death with their skateboards.
Yep.
And then the movie centers around this one girl played by Chloe Savini trying to find her ex-boyfriend whom she caught HIV from, so she can warn him so he's not spreading the infection around, because they're all being sexually promiscuous. So, and it kind of, what you're describing kind of reminds me of that movie, which I still can't completely get over the trauma of having seen such a poorly written and executed movie. But yeah, it seems like it's trying to depict children as being little monsters.
A little bit, and that ties, from my read of the movie, very much into the morality tale aspect of it. She meets these horrible children, but she feels empowered by their being monstrous because they're part of this secular culture and they're free to do terrible things. And the movie doesn't say these things are terrible, but you look at them and you look at how adults react to them, it's things that are reasonably going to be construed as terrible. The actress who plays Amy did a very good job with what she was given, and most of the movie rests on her shoulders, and she does an excellent job with that as an actress. And this is, I believe, her first film, which is even more impressive. But I want to get into the kind of the power dynamic along with the meta sexual exploitation issue. This was a movie with a broadcasting call, and I believe Amy's actress is an immigrant. She's probably an immigrant who comes from a tenement housing situation in France. I'd have to look it up to be certain, but I would not be surprised at that. So there's an inherent class dynamic issue where you have a elite culture figure in this young female director, and you have this young, impressionable girl who's the power dynamic without a strong parental figure in there to represent them. I'm not sure she understood what she was doing as a collaborator, nor any of the young people, because the director discussed the sexuality with them in appropriate ways, she said, and asked them how they wanted to be a part of that discussion. I don't feel that was an appropriate thing for her to do, because I don't think those young women were mature enough to fully participate in that. So I think that was a wrong decision that was the fruit of that led to all the other wrong decisions that happened with this movie. Then there is the broader context of, 600 girls doing twerking tryouts and things like that. Is that a morally correct thing to do, or is that morally exploitative? I think it is exploitative, and I don't honestly think it's something a film should do. I don't think it's pedophilia exploitative. I don't think it's pornographically exploitative, but it's clearly not an appropriate way for a responsible adult to treat children.
Yeah, and it seems to me like there's this rather long history of cinema where, because, again, having done some research on this, I've discovered the existence of movies where, yeah, just this movie is really tame compared to some of what I've read about regarding some of these other films. Like, for example, there's this film back in the 70s, or maybe it was late 60s, early 70s, but it dealt with like a child murderer who hides out in this farmhouse where he meets the 12-year-old girl, and they end up getting it on, and then she rats him out to the police, who end up killing him. So, but it's like, you've got this 12-year-old or her body double, depicting stuff. And it's like, how do you even begin to think that it was appropriate to involve a girl that young in a production such as this?
Exactly. I think that is a appropriate question to ask about this movie. I think the entire end dance sequence is very problematic, how it was shot. And as I said, if somebody who's an expert, because the classic line from, I forgot which Supreme Court justice is about pornography, is, I know it when I see it. So there's a lot of very subjective standards, but they're very technical subjective standards about what classifies as pornography or not. It's like Girls. Did you ever watch the TV show Girls?
No.
The sex scenes in Girls were shot in a way to not be provocative, to not be pleasurable. It was shot to be very unpleasant to look at. It was designed to make you feel extremely uncomfortable, but in such a way that the characters acting in the scenes felt much more gritty and organic. So there's a certain aspect to how child sexuality is portrayed here. It's very visceral to the point of being unpleasant to see. And that's something that I think
do you think that was intentional? Like, we're supposed to find it uncomfortable and unpleasant?
Well, no, more so. More so. It goes overboard in places, so I think that's an intentional choice to not be obscene, because it's going so far as to clearly be unpleasant for unpleasantness' sake. But again, that's an extremely technical distinction, and I don't fault anybody for having a disagreement. But I think broadly, the anger people are feeling, and there's also the counter side. There are people who are saying, well, why are you complaining about dance moms or teen beauty pageants? To which people who are saying that this is pedophilia bait are saying, well, no, we're complaining about those things too. And that's also part of the problem in the moral framework, is because people have decided, well, since there's the QAnon conspiracy that says that there's a broad global conspiracy of elites to molest children, that this has to be part of that.
Yeah, well
no.
To be fair, Joe Biden is actually caught on camera on C-SPAN molesting little girls, females of all ages. But
he's being inappropriate with young women. That is
right. Yeah, women of all ages, adult women, teenage girls, little girls. There's a couple of graphic videos showing him feeling up 2 children under 10.
Yeah.
One, the daughter of another United States senator back in 2015. So, yeah, they're to the extent that they are right. I mean, yeah, people like Biden or even Bill Clinton, who seems to prefer his victims older, but still, you've got Biden, who seems to delight in sexually assaulting women of all ages, but mostly targeting those who are most powerless. And that does include, yes, a lot of children a lot of the times, because he can plausibly deny it, or so he thinks, but there's footage out there showing him doing it.
But clickbait culture has very much made us all try to think with the "when did you stop beating your wife" mentality of things, as opposed to context, nuance, a sense of historical narrative. Like, on a slight tangent, we're seeing a lot of political violence in the country right now, but this political violence isn't unprecedented. If you look back 100 years ago or more, there's comparable political violence. To a lesser extent, there's comparable political violence 50 to 60 years ago. So we don't have that in our living memory. We don't have a good historical education system, so we can't think with that sort of historical mindset to give ourselves a broader perspective.
Right, and also keep in mind we didn't have the internet back then, and we didn't have social media back in the 60s or in the 1920s either.
But we can still have historical perspective and have social media. We don't need to let Google and Facebook make us not use the Google and Facebook that's in your head.
Right, because a lot of people do forget history, and frankly, that's why we keep having these problems. But it seems like a lot of it is amplified more because we are so connected to social media and we can share information just like that.
Right.
But, I think it's like, yeah, it's the same level as it's always been, but we're more aware of it now, primarily because social media doesn't give us the luxury of turning away or ignoring it, because you can turn off a television, but if you're on your phone, because we were made to rely on our phones more than ever, because in fact even the Facebook user interface is becoming unusable now on laptops and desktops because it's all phone-based orientation, and it's like, okay, so I'm not going to be able to use Facebook anymore, except maybe to share links because I can't figure out where anything is on the user interface on my desktop. But, it's like, but that same technology that forces us onto those phones is what allows us to be confronted really on a daily basis by a lot of what we're seeing on the news right now. And I think, part of that is maybe driving a lot of the backlash at movies like Cuties, because if you notice about human society in general and certain segments of human society, we like to pretend that if we can't see, hear, or talk about a thing, then it doesn't exist. Or we can pretend that we can like push it off on, the later generations and let them deal with it. But once it's in our faces, we can't deny it, and we're forced to draw a line in the sand and take a position, which leaves a lot of people very uncomfortable.
Yeah. And that's the broader thing I would say about this movie is it's not very good. I don't understand, well, let me rephrase that. Non-cynically, I don't understand how this got awards at award shows. Cynically, I totally understand. It's a black female Muslim, immigrant from France. Of course this is going to get all the awards from the award shows. Nobody's actually going to pay attention to what's in the movie.
Yeah. It does seem to me like a lot of people don't pay attention to what's in movies, especially at the Oscars, because if you look at some of the nominations, you wonder what they're thinking. But although, to be fair, I mean, Joker did do pretty well at the Oscars earlier this year, but Joaquin Phoenix and Todd Phillips are basically asking you to look at it as a Rorschach test. Whatever you read into it kind of says something more about you than it does about the film itself. And I think that's actually kind of parallel to what we're seeing with movies like The Trouble with Being Born and Cuties, where it's like what you read into it speaks more about you rather than what is actually in the movie.
Another scene of note in the movie that I didn't bring up before, there's a sequence as she's going through her progression of teaching the girls how to be more sexually provocative, where she's on her phone in a prayer meeting. She has wrapped her prayer shawl around her. It's kind of evocative of a kid hiding under a blanket looking at porn a little bit. And she's watching a sexually provocative rap dance, and she's kind of shaking around while she's watching it in a way that looks like either shaking and moving from traditional Islamic and Jewish kind of prayer, or shaking around because she's doing something else. But the movie makes it clear what she's doing, but that's sort of subtextually something you can kind of sequence there.
Yeah, it's basically what you choose to read into it, basically, depending on what perspective you're looking at it from.
Yeah. I mean, so the whole movie, though, spends most of its time on this young girl lying, stealing, using sex to get what she wants, corrupting her younger siblings, committing an act of violence, disrespecting her father, disrespecting her mother, disrespecting her elders. And then she has that moment of moral clarity, and then she goes home, she apologizes to her mother, and she gets to go outside and jump rope. So that is what the movie is. The stuff with female sexuality, it's in there, but the core plot is Amy's moral fall and then redemption. And not even redemption, her turning away from hell. That's the main plot line of the whole movie.
Do you remember the Iron Maiden song "Run to the Hills"?
Yeah.
And how that whole album was a story about a guy who comes along a satanic event in the woods and he rejects it. He runs away from it.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds a lot like what Amy does by the end of the movie is kind of like that. It's like she ultimately rejects it and runs away from it. But it just seems to me, though, that a lot of the outrage coming from a lot of YouTubers and people on Twitter and Facebook, it seems to me like a lot of them really have just kind of fallen for Netflix's cynical marketing ploy to get people to watch the movie. And, in Hollywood, no publicity is bad publicity. So,
well, I mean, this lost Netflix, what, $6 to $9 billion in stock value? I mean, that's not good publicity, considering how much they have to leverage their company to get money for productions. It's not good. This was not a good plan. I doubt Cuties got enough eyeballs to look at this, but I think this will blow over. This is less of a problem than what happened with Mulan, which was a terrible decision. It was never going to be popular in China, and Disney then actively went to do things to make it even less popular.
Yeah, and one thing that disturbs me about a lot of the Disney live-action remakes of their animated films is that what made the animated films good, even though they were often highly flawed and really not accurate to the cultures they're depicting, but there was at least a story there where you can invest in the character because the character was likable, sympathetic, someone you could root for, because when you do it's like basically in filmmaking, it's like you want to make your protagonist relatable and even likable, so that when you do all these horrible things to the protagonist, you end up cheering that person as the underdog against the big Goliath in the movie. But we're not seeing that anymore. We saw last year with Captain Marvel, Brie Larson playing a very unlikable protagonist. So it felt like, it's like this asshole coming from another planet. She's overpowered. No real weaknesses to speak of. She beats up a lot of people, then defeats the bad guy and takes off a limiting device, which makes her even more powerful. But she was already super powerful to begin with, so what's really changed? But then you take a movie like Alita, where you at least humanize her a bit, and that kind of helps redeem that movie. But I haven't had the opportunity to see Mulan yet because I'm not paying $30 plus the $9.99 for Disney Plus to see it. That's ridiculous. I might have paid an extra $10 on top of $9.99 to see it, but $40 for digital leasing of the movie, there was no way I would ever do that. Right.
I would actually consider starting to use the public library to see the movie on purpose because of that sort of a strategy. But let's start with the basic problem with Mulan as a movie, which is an important problem, which kind of dovetails a little bit with this, because Cuties was a movie that was foreign and being translated into English. So Disney decided to translate an American English movie into a foreign context, but why would you watch Disney doing an inferior version of a Chinese movie when there's, I think, like 8 or 9 Mulan movies that were done in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong? And I think there's 1 or 2 that was done in Thailand that are all better to the native culture and have the native cultural stuff down pat.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? Who in China is that for? Now, then this movie gets made in a way that is very ethno-nationalist within the People's Republic of China's current political framework, and it was filmed in an area where there is an active genocide going on. It's
well,
not
the evidence for that is kind of questionable. I'll point some.
People are being moved to camps. People are being forcefully moved to camps. That is technically a genocide.
Yeah, not if it's not happening though, because I can send you some news articles debunking a lot of that stuff. But you have to keep in mind
they're being moved to camps. There have been numerous videos of Chinese military forcing people onto trains, forcing people out of their villages.
Yeah, I'm going to call BS on that just because being involved in politics as I am outside of this YouTube channel, I have been keeping up on it, and a lot of what is being shat out of United States intelligence and corporate media, you really got to hold it up under a microscope, because when you look at the actual available evidence, it turns out to be
corporate media. Corporate media refuses to broadcast the images of what's going on in those provinces.
Well, are there any images to broadcast?
Yes. They've been broadcast over the internet, but they've not been broadcast on media sources because corporate media doesn't want to broadcast it.
All right, I'm going to have to agree to disagree with you on this, and maybe cheer for another video. But I actually have a political channel I'm trying to get off the ground. So if you want to discuss this on that channel, I'll send you a link to it.
Let's just say something that is argued by people to be a genocide, and they're doing something that fits into a nationalist propaganda agenda where the people who are purported to be undergoing a genocide are cast as the villains, and the Han Chinese are cast as the plucky heroes. This is, again, how did that get through the production process in Disney without somebody saying, wait a minute, this will be a huge problem? Before you get to the point where you have one of the lead actresses defending what happened in Hong Kong, and I'm not going to attack her for doing that because she has family in China. If somebody has family in China and they're a public-facing Chinese-American, Chinese-Canadian, Chinese-European citizen, and they feel pressure to protect their family back in China, I'm not going to be super critical of them making that decision because I probably would in their place too. But again, within that whole broad framework of that, how did anybody at Disney think this movie as it was constructed would be a good idea?
Right. Well, keep in mind, Disney has never really been all that culturally sensitive. They do use a lot of stereotypes that are either outdated or just completely fabricated. But it seems like
the live-action remakes are Disney apologizing for their prior use of bad stereotypes,
while creating whole new ones.
But unlike the rest of these, it went whole hog on some of this stuff. And I don't know how that was cleared through the process in Disney. I don't know if that had something to do with financing, co-financing. I've not looked into that. It's a very problematic idea. But again, at the end of the day, it's an American company trying to make something to a Chinese aesthetic that would also somewhat appeal to American and Western audiences, and nobody likes it.
Right. So basically, the more you try to please everyone, the more you please no one.
And also, you need to have a clear, concise vision for your film. The Chinese audiences are just as mad as the American fans that the songs were removed, because the songs were something they liked. The fact is that there is more humanity and pathos in the original Disney animated version of Mulan than in the live-action version.
Yeah, and also, from what I understand, there was a decision to remove the love interest, which, again, really kind of humanizes the protagonist and gives her something to lose.
But that gets into the political ideology of the Chinese government that's anti-homosexual.
Right. But the whole story is about a woman who dresses up as a man but isn't a man. Because by the end of the movie, right. I mean, she's drop the disguise, and it's like, okay, so that's that. I don't see how that should be a problem. But this whole concept, though, and I
But
think
the
the reason why
implication,
they removed the love interest in the live action remake was, for the same reason that Captain Marvel, Brie Larson is like just there, and there's no real love interest there, because it's like they're afraid to make the character seem human and therefore vulnerable, so they remove anything that would make her seem human and vulnerable. Because it's like you're not allowed to have a protagonist who's flawed or maybe not such a nice person, but has to go through a learning process and a journey where there's growth and evolution. The way it's
the two reasons they didn't do that in Milan. Number one is the Chinese perspective on homosexuality. Even implications of homosexuality are not allowed. It's verboten. The second thing is Disney is uncomfortable with the idea of a male being a heroic figure for a female character because of progressive female audiences in the United States. They're afraid of what is their core brand.
Yeah, and it seems to me like the people they're pandering to really weren't interested to begin with, so it's like Disney's really been kind of shooting itself in the foot, and so is Paramount and CBS, where it's like they're producing all this content for people who were never going to get into the property. It's like things like Star Trek and Star Wars had niche audiences, and those niche audiences pass the love for that onto their kids or grandkids now, but all that's gone away because they've alienated that core audience that you needed in order to branch out into the broader audience. So now you've got this tendency to really kind of pander to people who just had no love for it, and the people behind it have no love for the source material, hence abandoning what's been derisively dismissed as Gene Roddenberry's box. But there were actually very good reasons for why, he didn't want any serious conflict aboard a starship. Because if you look at the whole aesthetic of the original Star Trek, the ship is painted up to look like a United States naval vessel, and the rankings are, quasi-military for very good reason. Because on a naval vessel, you're on a ship for like 6 months at sea. You can't afford to have a serious lasting conflict among the crew because that can get people killed. And so you take that same scenario and put it into deep space, billions and billions of light years from home. Yeah, miles from home, I'm sorry. But, then it's even more important to maintain a sense of discipline and, family unit dynamic among the crew, because they cannot afford to jeopardize that mission or the lives of the crew by having any serious lasting conflict. And Alex Klutzman and Jar Jar Abrams took that and tossed it out the window and said, oh, that's not realistic. Yes, it was realistic. I mean, these people obviously never served in the military.
Now, on a related interesting note, people are now attacking the Dune remake for being a white savior narrative. And luckily, there are enough of us who read Dune, were engaged with Dune, and who understand these old sci-fi books thing. Like, if you think Dune was a white savior narrative, you didn't read the book. If you think it's a book about women waiting for a savior to come and save them, you didn't read the book. You may have read the words, but you didn't comprehend the words. You didn't let those sink in. If you think the Fremen are Arabs per se, you're not really paying attention to the book. And you're not paying attention to the book's themes of cultural imperialism, recasting colonial struggles for broader powers, how the noble savage is a mythology that's believed in by the elite, but it's not true when they find the people that they view as the noble savages, which makes them only want to co-opt them into their power structures more. And Paul Atreides, who in his own books openly discusses how he's easily killed more people than Hitler, and he turns away from that. And then in the later books, his son embraces killing even more people than his father as part of a long-term goal to save humanity. And it's a central thesis that no one should be the savior, because somebody who's the savior is really a monster if you look at it in the broadest historical perspective.
Yeah, because Hitler branded himself as a savior, and he turned out to be quite the monster of the 20th century. But yeah, it seems to me like, that there is a misreading and an attempt to kind of like, I don't want to say, I don't know if whitewash is the correct word, but kind of whitewash a lot of history.
It's a superficial reading of media is become dominant right now, because you can't sell nuance to clickbait, but you can sell superficiality.
Right, and that brings us back to the uproar over Cuties, because this is an uproar over superficiality. I mean, the whole marketing campaign was superficial. Netflix's attitude towards a movie is superficial, and people take a superficial understanding of the actual content of the movies so that they leap to judgment without even having seen it or seen it all the way through. And, to an extent, I can kind of understand how someone who's been a survivor of sexual abuse might be traumatized and reach a conclusion. But, again, you're basing it on what people who haven't actually seen the movie are saying and not firsthand knowledge from people who've actually seen it.
Yeah. And I kind of want to close all of this with an important point. So BAAAAD, the BAAAAD character by Sacha Baron Cohen, there's two things that make the joke work. There's a natural, within our Anglo-Saxon culture in America, tendency towards saying things and agreeing with things and being agreeable to be polite, and you're not paying attention. So really absurd, bizarre things, you're like going, yeah, sure, okay, wow, that's really interesting. And then there are people who are actually horrible, demonstrable racists and terrible people. But the way BAAAAD does his jokes, Sacha Baron Cohen acts like there's no difference between the two. And that's really what you need to understand to really understand the superficiality we've entered into in our pop culture.
Yeah, and I kind of got that from Cohen, because that there is no distinction when you're agreeing with something because you wholeheartedly agree with it, or agreeing with it because you're not really paying attention. So, which is worse? The person who's actively knows that you're being racist and is proud of it, or the person who's being racist but not really realizing it because you haven't really been paying attention to what this person is saying, and you're just like, okay.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is we need to think, we need to absorb things, we need to use our brains and understand things.
Yeah, and which you've helped me do a lot with this movie, because like I said, I wasn't originally going to watch it, but now kind of have to understand more of the context, because I do intend to explore this concept a little bit more in depth with some of my own takes. Because some of the comments on my other thread about the trouble with being born, and along the last Cuties video I did, really, it's illustrative of this whole lack of context and lack of nuance that people just seem to revel in not having that nuanced understanding, where they actually prefer to remain ignorant, because how dare you make me confront that this is going on, because now I have to deal with it. So I'm just going to make up a bunch of bullshit about wanting to protect children, even though, someone's a registered Democrat voting for Joe Biden, a serial child molester. So you're not really protecting anyone's children there if you're going to elevate him to the most powerful office in the nation.
Yep. So this has been about an hour of video, so I think that's a good cutoff point.
Yeah, So I'm going to leave it off there. But one thing I didn't want to close out on as a lead in into my upcoming RoboCop video, because I pretty much have it all written out. I just have to record the sequences while I'm trying to balance work and my other responsibilities. But the research I've been doing into some of what's gone into RoboCop, and a lot of my video has to do with responding to a point that Maggie Mae Fish made on her channel, and I'll send you the links through Discord so you can take a look at them. But the whole research that I've been doing into this with vigilante films and how RoboCop kind of lampoons these a bit is looking at Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry, and leaving the sequels aside because those saw a bit of an evolution as different directors and writers came aboard. But the original Dirty Harry film, there's a scene in there where one of the officers is telling how racist Harry is and rattling off a bunch of racial slurs, and this is to Harry's Mexican-born partner, because apparently he goes through partners like an elephant goes through peanuts, and we kind of got a hint why, because he refers to his partner by a racial slur used to describe Mexicans.
Or a sexist slur for that movie when he had the female partner.
Yeah. So it's like, one wonders, like, when people chastise me when I was trying to bring up this on my Twitter and in discussion, and I think you were part of that discussion in the Twitter group chat, is that we don't realize this stuff when we're watching it as kids because we're not focusing on that. We don't know to focus on that. But you come back later as an adult, and a lot of this stuff was actually controversial at the time it was first released. So it's not like, we have to, like, try and put this, like, false argument, oh, you can't look at it through the lens of today, you have to look at it through the lens of back then, because even back then that was controversial, and a lot of people reacted rather negatively to that.
So are you going to incorporate the Frank Miller script for RoboCop 2 in your video that ended up being adapted to a comic book, which was insane?
Yeah, there's going to be an allusion to that. I don't think it's really the main focus, because I think, by the time Irvin Kershner came along and retooled it, the film really, I think, stayed truer to the original film than RoboCop 3 or any of the other adaptations or even the reboot did. So I'm going to make a little bit mention of that, but Frank Miller is also another person who's written comic books where it's clear where he stands on certain issues, but at the same time he's especially his earlier work, he's a little bit more self-aware and willing to poke fun at himself and the material that he's adapting.
If you get a chance, I recommend Superman Black Label, which was him writing a definitive Superman story that was self-contained for his own ethos. It was very interesting, his ideas. I think it would have been better if he let an editor help him. But he probably said, I'm Frank Miller, I'm a living legend, threw a bottle of scotch at the editor and proceeded to work.
Yeah, and because it was Frank Miller, they ended up publishing the story as is, and maybe it's like, yeah, maybe not such a good idea because, look what happened with it. But that's a discussion for another time because, otherwise we'll be here for like 3 hours. And this video is already going to be a bitch to try and upload as it is. But I do thank you for coming on and discussing this, because I think what's really needed right now more than ever, especially in this clickbait era that we're finding ourselves in, there's this risk of the YouTubosphere, especially, groups like the Phantom Menace, where we risk becoming the very thing that our detractors say we are, because we don't want to take these nuanced conversations and really kind of discuss the content of the films and television shows that we're reviewing. So, and I get the feeling now, after a few years, it's, maybe because of like there's a lack of time or energy to devote to it, but, actually sit down and watch it from a critical point of view instead of like, just rushing to a judgment before you've maybe even seen the whole thing or given a second or even third viewing, where you have time to really kind of digest the material, which is not to say that I don't still have plenty of criticisms of Alex Klutzman's STD and the stolen content that he took from Anas Abdin. That's another video I want to do with you, because there was a second denial of the motion against CBS that went on recently, and I want to discuss that with you for another time. But like I said, I think there's this danger that we risk becoming the very thing that people say we are, and I think conversations like this, where we actually break it down and discuss it from a critical viewpoint and not simply trying to oversimplify things, is really important for us.
Another good video for Nuance I would recommend is one by a comic book YouTuber, Just Some Guy. He also breaks it down with a nuanced analysis. And again, this isn't a particularly good movie. It raises issues, but it doesn't say anything about the issues it raises, which is, I think, a sign of a failure in a film, especially if you're being an art house film. Yeah. Don't raise issues without saying something about them.
Yeah, and I remember seeing River of Grass a couple years ago and thinking, this is a horrible, horrible movie because 76 minutes and it feels like 3 hours. You're doing something wrong. Yep. Yeah, and I get the point that the director was trying to make, but it's like, and I think that was her debut film, so it left a lot to be desired, but it's still one of those things where it's like, oh my God, do I actually have to watch this again? No, I don't think so.
Well, anyway, thanks so much, and hopefully we can time up and set up another video.
That would be great. Awesome. Thanks again, Larry, and if you want to leave a comment below, people, please do so, because I would love to hear from you. If you like what you've heard and you want to hear more, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon and select all to receive notifications whenever we upload new content. Like this video, share it. If you want to help support the channel, keep the lights on, help us bring you more content, head over to our Patreon or our Subscribe Star page. We can't do this without you. Until next time, this is Michael Wilk for The Wilk Report saying take care. Good night. I'm out.